But so this is the terrestrial room. I'm sorry, and we are.
And there is an aquatic room that on Blue Jeans.
An aquatic room on Blue Jeans. Fun.
Yes, and if people want to be a part of that, maybe send a message to this, and I can tell them how to get there.
Okay. At this point, Bob's the only person. He wants to be on terrestrial.
Right.
And Nuke's in the atmospheric room, which is which?
Sophia B. Jones, it's about, yes, on the other side of this.
So if you care about the atmosphere. Yeah. All right.
Let's talk about terrestrial ecosystems.
Let's do it.
Are there people that are, is Bob on here still?
Yes, he is. You're too.
Well, Cynthia, what do you want to do? I guess it's you and me.
All right.
Jason, what do you have?
Luke, I was hoping that you could give us sort of a report back, just super briefly, on what came out of last year's Terrestrial Working Group, and then progress on anything from that before we delve into new business.
Another burn plot was what we talked about last year, and progress has been to move the plans for that back by 1 year. And to the degree that I'm involved in that discussion, I would love to see people who want to lead that sort of thing take charge. We had a good meeting this summer at the biostation to look around for potential sites to do another burn. I think that we were, I'll take responsibility for this, a little bit hasty. You can't walk around, 20 or 30 acres of burn plots in a morning and find the place where the next burn should be. For my part, one of the reasons we need to move this back is so that the location of the next burn is very carefully considered and is as representative as possible of the other previous burn plots, and also preserves space for future burns. I think the spot that we settled on won't work.
Is there a new tentative date then?
Well, we talked about doing pre-burn measurements this summer. The cut would then be fall 2016, and the burn June 2017 is what we had discussed. Isn't that right? No, the cut was to be this fall, 2015. The burn would have been June 2016. So, based on moving it back by a year, we have the cut fall 2016, burn June 2017.
So what was decided was wrong with the site?
We did a bunch of soil sampling out there this summer for Ultra and found some things that don't belong in that area. And recognizing that gentle south-facing slope we settled on as indicating something about why the soils are different in that area. The burn plots are supposed to be entirely sandy, weakly developed spotosols, the Rubicon series. Areas of the 1980 burn have pit and mound topography. Portions of the 1998 burn, those burns which are at the southern extent, we propose to do a burn even south of that. They have bands of loam below 60 centimeters that probably change the way water moves, they make the trees happier. It's not the same landscape ecosystem as the other burn plots. So we shouldn't expect a burn done in the place we settled on to produce a representative, or to be part of a consistent common sequence. We could do better.
Just to play devil's advocate, what the soils look like in the old burn plots. Are they uniform, or are they?
They're better behaved, yeah. The 36
on the clay in the 1980s.
The 80, yeah, 80 and 98, the ones at the south, those are the problems. The 54, the 48, the 36, and Yeah, those three it's just sand. Yeah, and then I think about, the places we walked around and noticed subtle things, there's more, you don't have to go very far outside of that block of treatment areas to get into some different conditions. The trees grow better. You can tell that there's some water friction happening there.
So that was sort of the main theme, but there were a couple other sort of tag-ons at the end.
As far as why to move the burn back?
No, I'm sorry, I was
Good. Thank you.
I was the non-burn related terrestrial working group stuff from last year. I was moving you forward, I'm sorry.
Same notebook. This is what you're gonna find. Does anyone else remember off the top of their head what the hell we talked about last year? Terrestrial meeting. Now, let's see. Not surprisingly, all I have from last summer is about our burn discussion.
Okay.
We did discuss some things of the LTREB, the carbon common sequence. But that was pretty focused on methods.
So, is there a specific plan in terms of pre-burn monitoring and who's going to do that, what's going to be monitored, et cetera, et cetera? Not yet.
That was part of the discussion last year.
Yeah, and for my part, I'd like to see someone say yes, and here's what it is, because I don't want to do that, or for people to offer what it is they propose to do.
But you're saying no, probably not.
There
Not
isn't one
planned.
now. No.
But if you're pushing it back here, then maybe there's not a big rush.
That's why you're not getting an answer, because we got another year.
Yeah. Well, I have other reasons for getting second thoughts about the burn plot, and one of them is something that you mentioned that I had to think about a lot. But you described difficulties in getting funding for fire research that's basically east of the Missouri. This isn't the part of the world where the country where fires are. And these aren't fire-prone ecosystems. The place we're talking about doing this burn, the burn plots represent what happened, a historic having a land clearing. It's not that we have fire-prone ecosystems that we study there. So to me, the relevance of the questions I'd like to ask is questionable. Should we studying jack pine near Mile or something if we want to do burn research?
Or on Douglas Lake Road west.
Sure, that could work too, yeah. Well, it's fortunate that there's not an overwhelming amount of interest in the burn discussion here, because I myself would rather discuss other things too. I think there is with the collection of people we have here, though, it would be a fruitful time to discuss I think Facet and Ameriflux, LTREB, some of the carbon cycle stuff that we do. And what Raleigh is working on with revisiting landscape ecosystem plots, the watershed work that Paul and Jason and Jim and others and I are doing. Perhaps you can tell I'm pretty excited about this landscape ecosystem stuff, but there's an awful lot there, and there's ways to make all kinds of our research projects better by taking advantage of that. And there's people here who have experience with generating the data that went into that.
So in your watershed study, what do you need in terms of terrestrial data that would help questions? Like, you need vegetation characteristics across the whole watershed. You already have canopy height, biomass, all that stuff from the LiDAR.
Yeah. I guess really all of the above. Raleigh perhaps you could tell everyone about what it is that you spent last summer doing, and that would give us an idea of what has already been done. That's a big chunk of work as far as inventorying the plant cover.
Okay. Let's look at my presentation, which will be next.
Oh shit, that's
So,
right.
no, it's okay. I just blazed through those slides. I sought out to revisit a lot of these permanent plots set up by Doug Pearsall and his group 25 years ago. And the plots that Luke and Paul were showing, those 5, were ones that I went and found and recensus. So we have data on the vegetation there.
The cover.
The cover, yeah. And also from the soil pits that were done 25 years ago, all of that information is available as well. So, and then there are many, many more plots that I did not go to that are all across the landscape that have data for them, taken 25 years ago. So it'd be really interesting to see kind of the changes that have happened over that time period and to use these as a resource for many people as permanent plots that represent the landscape of the University of Michigan Biological Station.
So to that, I would say, Bob, that point is that the cover, like what is present, the composition of what is present, some of that is Raleigh's dissertation. Since you asked about the watershed study, I'd be interested in someone doing maybe a higher density of that sampling. I mean, 10 plots within a 200-acre watershed is a little bit on the undersampled side. Certainly the production component of it is something that, we can make some inferences from Ameriflux across the road, because at least for the upland parts of the watershed they are basically the same. There's a lot of similar ecosystem types there. But
I mentioned it because that's the kind of thing, focused on a watershed like that. That's the kind of thing that the forest ecosystem class can tackle as like a research project. Sample a bunch of plots, collecting from your cores, doing some biomass. So, just. Sorry.
well, I am. I'm in anguish about this because here, why am I getting to do all this talking? Everybody's got their projects, and you can only do so much in the summer. And I'm, for my part, more interested in working on this watershed stuff with Paul than with allocating that time and effort to another burn plot. So I feel some hesitation to ask you to jump on what I've chosen as my flavor of the next few years. If it does good things for forest ecology class, that's very good. If there's a way it can be incorporated into the landscape ecosystems work so that it adds to something that's bigger than this particular little slice of it in the form of a watershed, that's good. But I think naturally of vegetation production. Well, who's going to do that? There's Ultra, there's Ameriflux and Facet. There's an awful lot of time and effort that those of you who do that are already devoting to those experiments. And I don't want to ask for too much. At the same time, I'll say that I'm going to be at the biostation for a while doing stuff like this, and this is what I want to spend a lot of my time on. So if you see some benefit to working together on this particular patch of the property, maybe taking some of the carbon cycle stuff in a different direction, thinking more about the carbon coupling of the terrestrial to the aquatic. At NACP a month ago, there was a lot of people talking about how understudied is the nature of the terrestrial to aquatic carbon cycle linkage in the North Temperate and Boreal, and this is a place where we could do that.
Luke, I was just going to say that we might also consider next year DOE, as DOE test now focuses on the terrestrial aquatic interface. There may be opportunities for resources, because what you're describing requires more resources or more personnel. And I don't think there were that many applications this past year for that.
There's not a lot of places that are set up to do
Right.
that. I mean, it could be strategic to build on what UMBS has to do, like a land to water carbon cycle type of thing.
And there's the lake tower now
Yep.
operating, so we have the infrastructure in place.
So, Paul was mentioning things about forest management in his presentation on the watershed. And someone asked the question to you, like, oh, is there any possibility, or would you be interested in management within that watershed? I'm guessing not, you probably want to keep it as a reference, but what I'm wondering is there another watershed similar to it on the property that we could manipulate? I grew up in Hubbard Brook, so.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We could never do what Hubbard Brook does.
No.
But that idea of having a control on the treatment, there's some version of that is possible. I don't know where exactly, but.
Talk about that tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, but yeah.
Talking about that tomorrow.
So just an introduction. So Kyle Anderson's been working with us for the last couple of months to start thinking about a management plan for the station as it relates to how silviculture. No, I'm going to totally back up from that statement. I did not say that word at all. How we might manage the 10,000 acres below the bridge and the 3,000 acres above the bridge. How we might manage our systems with teaching and research in mind. Yeah. Yeah, please do, start over.
Yeah, what he said. Just thinking about how we'll want to do our experimental modifications in silviculture. We do want to do response to invasive species and climate change in a way that's consistent and will promote continuity of management practices and the forest ecosystems going. Trying to get a handle on that and a framework for future decision making.
Sort of what Kyle's done is compile all the historic data about what's happened on the landscape, and then sometime in the near future, be reaching out to all the stakeholders on some guidance moving forward about how we want to construct the management plan.
I think a lot of that management discussion, and my fervent opinion is that most of this should pertain to doing something with those cornfield red pine plantations. But perhaps at the same time, maybe even subsidize some of buy those, maybe some thinning or even clear cutting of red pine plantations, some management in Music Aspen that happens to be within a watershed or doesn't. Might produce some research opportunities that are management relevant.
We did some management not too far from the headwaters of the years. Cut thinning, some of them are clear cut, some of them are not clear cut. Looking at the relationship of the nutrient loss through clear cutting versus not clear cutting. And also, we're talking a lot about watershed now. The first project the biological station got funded at all was in 1972 called, which actually developed into the Watershed Council. It had to do with land use and water quality. So it's very amazing how it's all coming back now to that we didn't think about groundwater much.
So we'll be sending out a survey asking people for their ideas and plans and visions of the landscape going into the future. Would this be an appropriate time to brainstorm what sort of research-oriented landscape manipulations might happen? We're especially interested in ways that research can be paired with silviculture. So management of those red pine plantations, if we did want to do an aspen harvest for other ecological regions, how can we get the maximum use out of such an operation? If this is the right time to talk about that.
I think so, yeah. I think that there's interest in the room on many fronts in there.
So my only thing I'll say, I'm going to put it on the list And then I thought maybe we could also just go around and make sure that other terrestrial types of interests are represented. And then that way we have a parking spot for them so that we don't take the whole rest of this time just talking about that. Okay. So what's the 5-word?
Management and manipulations, brainstorm, session. With our 5 words.
Wow, that time is so.
Well, red pine plantations, I mean, what are they doing? What could be done with them? They're not, I think that would, most of us agree that from the wildlife and organismal point of view, they're not what they could be. There are places where red pine silviculture is very well established that we can't really be those places, but I do think that if we're researchers and also involved in the stewardship of the place, we ought to care about doing something with those red pine plantations that makes them better.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that sort of in Minnesota, for example, there's lots of really good established research on how to ecologically manage red pine. And one option would be just take what they found and apply it so that we're actually ecologically managing red pine plantations. And then use whatever cash comes out of those red pine plantations to support management in places that are helpful to our other projects. I don't know how helpful it would be to have a big research focus on red pine silviculture at the biostation. I would suggest probably not that. Replicating things by people that aren't necessarily silviculture focused.
But I think that it might make good opportunities for student and class projects.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do it in a way that's sort of interesting experimental treatments, but we shouldn't necessarily look at it as driving research focused on red pine. It's more like, okay, we're going to implement some of these treatments that other people have worked on, and then classes can use them. RU students.
Do you feel like that existing pool of research is largely forestry oriented? Would they have looked at how the effects of these silvicultural practices would affect aquatic ecosystems or hydrological regimes?
I doubt they would have looked at aquatic ecosystems. I mean, the Forest Service in Minnesota has done a lot of work, and some of it does focus on sort of associated organisms, even on sort of riparian systems and that kind of thing. But I think there's always other things you can look at.
Yeah, the situation of some of those red pine plantations would lend itself well to that. There's the stuff right adjacent to the Maple River near Pellston. A lot of them are kind of high and dry. A lot of them are where they belong.
I don't know what the fiscal contribution of those plantations would be, but while the station has a long-term history of descriptive and experimental work, we don't have a long-term history of restoration work. And so is it possible to look at these potential cash cows and then something that might turn into long-term recovery restoration projects?
I think that's our vision. Is we've inherited this legacy of heavily overstocked plantations, some of which have been managed to be more or less ecological deserts below the red pine. They've been silviculturally managed to just promote red pine growth. But we'd be thinning them with not a clear cut being a final objective. The final objective would be like a red pine cathedral or some sort of natural ecosystem, I think. I doubt that any sort of just cash cow oriented logging would get past the brass.
Yeah, it's not really the term. You used that tongue in cheek. Mark has a good frame of reference, I think, for both the past and also more recent discussions with Bob about what this would actually generate from a revenue point of view. It is modest. It's not an NSF award even.
But I'm having my 11 acres of red pine thinned as of this week. 11 acres of red pine I planted about 45 years ago, and then thin ones, this will be the final thinning, going to produce about $15,000.
What's the acreage roughly of red pine on the property?
1,300 were originally planted, of which at least several hundred are in dense plantations. We need to do an inventory to see what's overstockable plantation and what experienced lower survival.
And quite a bit older.
Uh-huh.
Most of them, right?
I beg your pardon?
Most of them are older than 45.
Yeah.
So it could be that the total revenue, I don't think we should think about this for long, but it is like of the scope of one research grant if the whole property were to be done.
So it's more than pays for itself, which is important.
The one thing that also can be added to that is, people, I'm not involved in restoration ecology much, but I know people who do. One of the biggest complaints is there's a lot of money to do a restoration, and very little effort or money available to follow up and monitor the long-term efficacy of those restorations. A lot of times money to, okay, fix it, and then walk away.
You can do that with money or with people, and I think that it's been a while since I was an undergraduate, but I think a lot of undergraduates come to an interest in ecology through the desire to be in something they view as saving something, and if this could be a really good way to set up to encourage interests that don't find an outlet at the biostation presently by, framing some of this as restoration. And
Or a new R&D program.
oh, yeah, that's big.
Okay.
What's that?
Or go home. Think bigger, go home, yes.
Yeah, that has to happen soon, right? If the current REU does anybody know about that? When does the current REU end?
Well, I think they have 3 years left. Or maybe
It takes 3 years to get
maybe
one.
2 years left.
Okay, so I will figure out what we're going to do.
Good.
As I said, if we talk about it in terms of restoration, that vision of where we headed is really important. Those ones that are down by the Maple River, is our vision for them to look like the Felsen Plain?
That's what'll happen if they get clear cut.
Yeah.
And that just to when Kyle gets the survey out, correct me, but I feel like of all the questions that we're asking in the survey, I think one of the most important things is what is that vision and goal for not only what you feel should exist on the landscape, but how it matches with research. Because, one of the things that we've been hearing over the course of trying to come up with a management plan is, like, what are the list of options? What are the scenarios that we might be able to present to whoever? And the goals and the vision, depending on how that's framed, either make the options endless or they constrain them in such a way that it doesn't leave opportunities for other options. Does that make sense? So if your goal is to if your goal for a land management plan is to harvest as much red pine as possible and get some money to pay for some buildings or to get some money to pay for some future research, then that constrains your set of options, but it also constrains, sort of what the other potentials are. Whereas if you have a broader vision or list of goals, then you can start to tailor options according to those. That's what we really want to that's what I would really love to hear back from people when we do that, is sort of like, what is that vision for land management, or what is that vision for restoration, what is that vision for research? Because that will help us sort of what exists on the ground, what are the options that we have that can sort of meet those needs of the community.
kind of wondered what we restore that into.
Mm-hmm.
Is restored into what's there now, or what may be there in the future, like hundreds of years maybe.
Mm-hmm.
You look at some of the tree species just south of us, Indian River, there's white oaks everywhere. It's more of a subtle species, and maybe it's creeping up. We got to think about a portion of that. That'd be kind of interesting. Research plan, or having garden, sort of these common gardens at different locations.
I think that's a really cool idea. Another thing that has occurred to me is that the red pine cover type is present in places where it doesn't belong. I don't think many of them, but there are places that were set into plantation that the ecosystem type says something different, and it would be neat to learn about. I wouldn't be set up to study this, but I think that someone could if this were of interest. But what does it take to get to restore an artificial cover type into a native one, so to speak? Can you just get rid of the red pine and the northern hardwoods continue to recruit from the understory, or is an assisted migration type of thing where you implant oaks from there or another species from nearby? I think these are questions that would be good for class projects, potentially for research grants. I'd also like to think about cover types other than red pine. That's really all I've considered, in terms of this management discussion. But there is a hell of a lot of aspen that's fallen over and rotting, and a lot of that, in my opinion, should be allowed to continue. But we've learned some things in Facet about the fact that you can kill a whole bunch of the aspen and the carbon status stays the same. There's at least over the time period we've monitored it. So
nitrogen status too.
Does that mean that we could use our research to inform management that says it's okay to do some harvesting?
Well, from a carbon standpoint, harvests are a positive thing, right? You're taking all that stuff all that matter out of the ecosystem and locking it up in furniture or pallets or what have you.
The people who measure that, they have so many ways of accounting the life cycle analysis. Yeah, it seems like where it goes is a big part of it. If it goes to Time magazine, it's one cool lifetime. If it goes into furniture, it's another.
I was thinking, yeah. It seems like they're, 1,300 acres. You're not going to, is that what it was? 13?
Oh, in plantation, red pine.
Plantation. Not all of that will be manipulated for the purpose of, introducing some experiment. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to focus on the area that is harvested for the purpose of finance, basically return, an economic return, right? I mean, there's some objective. It sounds like one interest is an economic sort of objective and interest. And then there are some areas that may be strategically preserved or manipulated. That's going to be pretty different, I think, the approach in how that plays out. Because I'm just thinking of the logging companies and how this is performed. You're not going to make a lot of money necessarily off of the experimental manipulation, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like there may be two objectives. They don't necessarily overlap entirely. And don't need to, given the amount of money.
That's a good point. Not only do they not overlap, but they're probably farther apart than I can really appreciate in terms of how it actually happens is what you're getting around to,
And it might be interesting to think about not designing an experiment and then asking it for it to be implemented that way, but to actually study something that's a common management practice. What we ask them to do is probably a very, 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 very small percentage of how silviculture is typically done.
Right, but the common management practice in red pine so thick. If there's that much forest clear, I don't know how much compare those to restoration-focused
Parkland
treatments
type.
that are now becoming part of the toolkit for, especially Forest Service, Nature Conservancies.
I think a lot of people study management. I think the question to ask is, what do you do at a biological station to study the biological effects of different management practices on a red pine plantation? So when people manage red pine for timber, when they extract timber, they're removing carbon and energy from the system. I can imagine you could treat some plots by thinning them as normal and other plots by thinning them the same amount and just dropping that wood and leaving it. And then you have a long-term manipulation to look at the effects of removing that carbon and energy versus not removing that carbon and energy. People 5 years later could look at biodiversity of fungi or insects, patterns of carbon storage over time. That would be a way to do a simple manipulation now, and you have a resource for the future.
And these are ecological questions,
right.
not management questions.
Right. Exactly. But there's a regional application. If red pine is being managed throughout the region, from a study like that, you could learn what effect is that having on carbon and biodiversity. Right? What effect is normal management having regionally on carbon and biodiversity?
You even make some assumptions about different landowners and how likely, if you're thinking at a regional scale, how likely they are to utilize some of these practices. PNC, for example, would actually just leave cut and leave stuff, and they have large landfills of cut on red pine.
So of this, you said 1,500 acres in red pine?
1,300 were planted, but a small, or I guess less than half of that would be densely stocked plantation today.
So is there a good inventory of these stands?
No, we know what's been managed in the past. That's been silviculturally treated in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but we need to do a walkthrough inventory, I think, to get a handle on how many of them are.
So is there a bureaucracy? I mean, these are university lands, these are state lands that would limit what could happen in these?
It's all station land.
It's all station land? I mean, it's not maybe the best metric, but using Mark's numbers, if you can get 15K out of thinning 11 acres, you thin 1,500 acres, that's $2 million.
But it's at a stocking density.
Yeah.
Thinnings.
Right.
That's much older.
Yeah. Yep.
I couldn't say. I doubt that it will be, like Luke said, I doubt we'll be making a huge amount of money off of this. And I don't want people to walk out of the room thinking UMBS is cutting their forests, burning the furniture to stay warm in the moment, you know. I think that we'd frame this around trying to improve the ecosystems and make them more healthy and complex. And if we make a little bit of money on that, on the side, that's great. But mostly the timberman would be our free ticket to getting some vast manipulations done.
I bet that a detailed analysis of those 1,300 acres and the things that have been mentioned, the stocking density, the age, also the site quality, would reveal the actual returns would be less. A lot of them are, think about how many of them are on the Pellston Plain, and the fact of what happens when you open up a red pine canopy on the Pellston Plain, and who said something about make it look like the Pellston Plain. It's good. It's taken a long time to recover from that.
That kind of project that you just described to characterize how much is there, and it seems like it could be another good project for the forest ecosystems class.
We did actually sample some of the plantations a couple of years ago, so we got some data, which I don't know if you ever got that data, but I'll see. That's why we have these meetings.
That's what I like to hear.
We'll talk about the data quality.
Yeah. Well, there's different quality levels. You just say.
So, do we know about when the thinning would actually occur? Because some people might want to get in there through sampling So, I mean, I had a meeting with him earlier this week, and he had mentioned that he had talked about possible fittings this upcoming winter.
2016?
Right, well, there was also a discussion about the burn happening the year after. If that was gonna happen, part of the thinning would have funding.
That's what we discussed, wasn't it?
Yes. If that's still a discussion. And even if it's not, if you were still planning on thinning sometime soon, it'd be nice to know when that was happening, so we can come in for people who would wanna take retreatment data, call it treatment. That'd be something nice to know. Treatments, and fields and stuff.
With the way things move, I can't imagine that there would be any sort of thinning within the next 2 years. That seems, I mean, if there was, it would be to directly start a project like a burn plot, because those other things are moving forward. But I can't, in terms of a plan and having some buy-in from a large stakeholder group and getting permission and implementing it.
I was just thinking, so whether it's an economic or science objective, we need data, right, to figure out what we want to do with 1,300 acres of red pine, which is probably pretty diverse, even though it's red pine, age, and structure. And so I wonder if an action item could be having, a timber cruise, or maybe it's a more scientific inventory, but having an inventory and then report on that next year. I mean, it sounds like it's not, the data aren't available yet, but to really lay out objectives, you have to have.
I think that's the best thing that's come out of this so far, this discussion, is and thinking about the forest ecology class in terms of maximizing student interest in something that matters to the station, management that begets research opportunities. I think that's a slam dunk, is you get the forest ecosystems class to over the next year to. It's your class. I can't. I'm saying this as a kibitzer, but I would think that would be hell. Maybe some of the ecology classes would want to do that too. It matters. It would produce information that informs the station how to manage its lands. It sets the stage for informed research, relevant management decisions. It takes a lot of people covering a lot of ground.
Really boring.
Yeah.
Well, 1,300.
Well, subsampling. I don't know, or zoom in on the 5 largest plantations, because contiguity matters when you're actually getting somebody out there to do something. But
so we already got some data, and we'll talk about that. But the other thing that, in addition to having the data, there also needs to be sort of a review of what are our possible endpoints, what is the current literature say about it. So there needs to be sort of if we want to go into this, we need data, we also need sort of that vision. Where could we go, and what might treatments look like, that kind of thing. You almost do that independent of having the data, and then the data can inform where.
Yeah.
I think that NC National Wildlife Refuge has done a lot of work on red pine, including interaction with fire. So I think if you talk with them, they have get to at least some predicted, develop some hypotheses based on their work.
Greg Corus, Charles Gable,
Right.
and so on.
Other large themes, can I back away from red pine for a second?
I think that would be great.
I really like Ryan Schulten's idea of just thinking about diversity. I like the insight. I like how you're describing diversity, but not just collecting data on diversity for diversity's sake, but then thinking about how people are applying that and using that. I think that could be a theme of biological station research. Is what is the diversity that's out there? How is it changing? What don't we know about the diversity that we should be thinking about and exploring? And then I'll put a plug in for my own research, which is studying fungal diversity. So Chris Goff and I are thinking about doing some fungal research too. So I'm sure a lot unknown about the fungal diversity of the station. And so
And so adding that kind of information and then thinking, exploring, like, okay, well, not just diversity, but how can we use that data then to inform other research projects or essentially grants?
Particularly through the modern methods such as you employ, it seems that it's kind of paradoxical that UMBS is some of the best, mosses and Alexander Smith, the fungi. It's so well studied in the morphologic and species concepts, but there haven't been people working in omics types of data collection. I guess that applies more to fungi than to insects. You can.
Yeah, so that my biggest suggestion is actually one of those interface things. And so the aquatic insects are the major interface between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems across the landscape of UMBS. And that's one of those areas that we have severe knowledge deficits for. If you're talking about potential of starting something that would look at the interface between terrestrial and aquatics and look at carbon and nitrogen flow, right? So what you said was exactly what people always think, right? Terrestrial to aquatic flow, but it happens the other way. And that's due to insult. And that's actually really well documented on small stream systems.
We talked about the vernal pool systems a little bit.
Yeah.
Has anyone done any? I mean, Bio Station's been there forever. Has anyone ever studied it?
I don't know. Those in particular, or any of the vernal pools on the station property for that matter? I don't know.
Well, I know that Amy Schrank wants to move in that direction, and also Michigan Natural Features Inventory is putting a lot of effort into doing large-scale mapping and documentation of vernal pools in our region. And so there's going to be, hopefully, it's MNFI and MTRI, Michigan Tech, are trying to get that. So it would be, they're looking for people to partner in doing the scaling down and up of the study. And I'll also say that, so we have about 10 minutes left of the time that we had said we were going to meet for this first part. And, the intent was to sort of get all the big projects or the big sort of themes out there, wrestle with them enough to where they're sort of loosely defined. And that when we get back together for lunch, that we would come back together as a terrestrial group, and then we would say, okay, let's split off into maybe 4 or 5 groups based on these themes that we talked about, and let's nail down some specifics of projects, collaborations, writing things, that kind of stuff. And that would be what the sort of next working group time is after lunch. So in the 10 minutes we have, let's try to flush out or any other themes. Yes, Jeff?
Do it.
I had a question that I heard about a project, and I was just curious if there's more information about this. I work here at the Botanical Gardens in Arboretum, and there was a project involving using handheld devices, iPhones or something, to collect data. Can you say anything more about that?
Sure. Oh, that's me. Yeah. Oh, well, just this. So we have a
terrestrial project.
So I guess it's terrestrial in that we have a grant from the university's instructional support services to outfit classes with the tech they would need to, in the field, digitize observations and collections. And so it really wasn't fully functional last year. We had just gotten the money to do it in June before classes started. But now we have 10 iPads for the station, and we have databases set up by taxa or by class, essentially. So, birds, plants, that sort of thing. And so they're going to go out in the field and be collecting observations. So if they see, so observations information, which are important for all kinds of different studies, but then if they actually do make a collection, be able to get that finer resolution
of data that's associated with the collection so that it can be streamed directly into some of these larger systems, either at the museum or eBird or something like that.
So it's a combination of software, the database, or some programs that you.
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple, but it's just, sort of working out the schema of the data that you want to collect ahead of time and making sure it matches with the end location, the repository it's going to go to. So, Brian's class data matches with the data schema that the Museum of Zoology is going to use for their insects collection. So it doesn't just sort of sit somewhere because no one wants to sift through it to put it into the larger collection database. eBird, so for Dave Ewer's class, the data schema for data collection of bird observations is based on what eBird does, and so it's a batch upload at the end of the class session. eBird gets all the UMBS observations as long as the students input them in.
Would you say we prototyped it in September?
And what I really want to also do is sort of say that it's also available for research outside of the class sessions. And so we can, if you actually have some, data collection that you want to do in the field with the device, it could benefit from that, and we can get everything set up ahead of time and send you out in the field with the device to do the collection.
I think it was most useful for us as a navigational aid. I mean, we limited by the GPS resolution, we were able to say, all right, now here's where the landscape ecosystem plot 9456 should be, but we know from the field notes, which you had uploaded onto there, that it's on a south aspect and this % slope, and we're looking for a big maple, and then the topo map. The orienteering and the ability to have basically a dozen different kinds of maps in something you can hold in your hand. And then you had the pre-populated data fields for when we were going around to those soil pits and redoing them. I found it kind of confusing because it's not how I've ever approached research. Sheets of paper and, a compass is different. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but it seems to me it has a great use just from finding your way.
And also, I'll say that LSA IT is, based on what we did, is going to be developing a device pool for all of LSA and some support to be able to do this at a greater scale. So the plan is to have like 50 iPads for checkout for class or for any other terrestrial insect organism interaction interest? Yes.
We're really interested in forest flora food webs. I don't know who else might be interested.
Forest flora food webs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bird microbe interactions.
I think that's really important stuff to study. Those leaves aren't decomposing themselves. And it's not just fungi doing it, which I think I realized sometime last fall, or maybe it was last week. I'd like to make a pitch for how we come back to this after lunch, and disagree with me because my feelings won't be hurt. But two things. I think we largely do our own thing, and we make good lip service to working together. And we've had some good, the insect work in Facet, showing wood decaying beetles. There's some really good success stories. But what we should do as a group is really integrate. Not just be carbon cycle people and insect people, and occasionally we come together. I think we need a project that is integrative, because that's what funding agencies want, because that's what ecosystems are. And a keystone for that could coincidentally be a watershed study that integrates water and land and acknowledges that birds disperse seeds and insects decompose wood and macroarthropods and microbes interact in the forest floor. That if we could find one place where we could all do our own little part of the expertise, we could probably produce something that no other place could. again, disagree with me, but I'm making the pitch that a watershed is the way to approach that, because it integrates different parts of the biosphere, but also it allows everybody who studies the different parts of the ecosystems to do so in a place that is itself integrative.
You guys talked about doing isotope labeling stuff in that watershed. You were thinking enough.
No, actually, oddly enough.
But that just seems that's one way where you can figure out
Yeah.
where's all that carbon.
Yeah.
It seems to be different parts of it.
One thing we talked about last year was the legacy data collections of UMBS, and is there a way to also integrate those into new questions and new approaches that are being put forward? Can they be, one of the legs in the stool that helps support these important questions? We got started on something, we got into a white paper, Jason took the lead on that, and I think it's been
Which is why it's floundered for.
No. I remember lots of emails that people didn't answer, but I know who they are.
So I'm gonna talk very briefly tomorrow about sort of where the whole collections digitization project is at. Because that's the other part of the grant that we got from Instructional Support Services, is to digitize existing data so that it can be incorporated into teaching and research. Well, the grant says teaching, but teaching and research. So it would be important if we're going to start talking about legacy data digitization and consumption, to sort of identify, what are the actual collections that need to be prioritized. Because I chose the herbarium because it was the low-hanging fruit. The next low-hanging fruit is the parasites collection. But there's others. And probably more importantly, it's probably important to start thinking about how we express our desire to use other people's data, or say the value of, say, the museum's data collection, how valuable it would be to have that digitized to use for teaching and for research. Because what we have up at the station is just a very, very small percentage of the records for our region.
Go back to the watershed suggestion for a second. I like the idea of the watershed as an integrating framework. I think that's a really good idea going forward. But the small watershed ecosystem isn't going to work because of the deep sandy soils. And so it's an issue of scale. You have to think about watersheds at a much larger scale. And maybe that's the way to approach it, is to say the small watershed ecosystem isn't going to work. So what does work in this very different morphology? And that's the organizing framework too.
Thank you. That's valuable, difficult criticism to hear, but it's true. But as Paul and I have thought about where we want to go with this, we see it as, as a hair sprouted out of the head of the inland waterway. Because that's the watershed. And I don't even know how you study water at that scale. That's why hydrologists like Valery are really important to this.
But so may I ask, what is the concern about small watershed? If you actually adjust the gradient of going from headwater areas to permanently or nearly permanently waterlogged areas, it provides kind of an initial gradient of lines. And I'm not an ecologist to actually comment on the scaling effect of the ecological component, but pedagogically speaking, yes, it makes sense because you get different dynamics.
Maybe there are questions that make sense at different scales, and that the purpose of integrating our research is so that we're studying and asking questions at scales that are appropriate to our interest, but they also they scale up, and there's different questions and different types of data that are collected at a different scale that are informed by the smaller scale, and the smaller scale stuff is informed by the larger scale. I'll also say that Alicia said it's time for us to eat, and this is the room we're supposed to be eating in, and so people are in there waiting for us to eat.
We're popular.